Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to start on chapter 12. As I mentioned in the video regarding the AP test, if you watch that, they have shortened the AP test fairly significantly, cutting out a couple units. A lot of the things in chapter 12 are still going to be on there, so we will cover this chapter in its entirety. Chapter 13 we will not cover in its entirety. I'm just going to kind of pick at a couple things in there that I think are relevant. So this is the last chapter that we will do from start to finish. So your packet for this chapter is going to be due on Wednesday, April 8th, so the week after spring break. That packet will be available. So today's lecture is actually going to be very, very short. I just want to kind of do a brief introduction to this chapter. Tomorrow we will cover central place theory, which is probably the most important part of this chapter in terms of the last of our big models or theories that we're going to be taking a look at. Now, in chapter 12, we are really paying attention to the tertiary sector jobs that we talked about back in previous chapters. So we talked about primary versus secondary versus tertiary sector jobs. And in this chapter, we're going to look at the types of services that fall into the tertiary sector. So today, the tertiary sector has grown significantly in the United States, such that 80.1% of jobs in the U.S. today are tertiary sector jobs. So clearly, that doesn't mean we don't have people who still don't farm for a living or do manufacturing, things that would fall under primary or secondary, but today it's about 80% of jobs fall into the tertiary sector. So we'll break those down for you today, kind of look at where those jobs are. We're going to look at where those jobs tend to locate, and we've talked about agglomeration or clustering in previous chapters, and we see that a lot with tertiary sector jobs like we do with manufacturing jobs. So when we talked about the manufacturing chapter, we talked about the idea of a parts supplier maybe locate right next to a Ford dealership if they provide parts to that dealership, things like that. Well, the same thing happens in the tertiary sector as well. So when we look at service sector jobs, restaurants, businesses like that, they tend to cluster like we see on Miller Lane and places like that. So we'll look at where those places locate. We're going to look at the distribution of services targeted to businesses. So we're going to look at, in addition to manufacturing companies that serve businesses, we also have tertiary sector companies that also serve businesses. And we're seeing that right now if you look at what's going on with our supply chain as it relates to food and things like that. Grocery stores are tertiary sector, service sector businesses, and we have all of those places that supply them that are so critical in a time like this. We'll take a look at where those are located, and then we're going to look at the idea of globalization and why globalization matters in terms of the clustering of tertiary sector jobs, particularly in international markets. This is when we're going to talk about the influence of companies like Amazon that do all of these international trade and things like that as it relates to service sector things that you can buy at the grocery store that you can get more conveniently shipped to your door. Now, today we're going to look at the three types of service sector jobs in the United States. So we can kind of cluster service sector jobs into one of three categories. So we have what we call consumer services, business services, and public services. So we're going to take a look at those three things today. Now, today, consumer service jobs represent about half of all jobs that are existing in the United States today. So a consumer service is any company whose primary purpose is to provide services to individual consumers. So we're not talking about businesses here. We're talking about individual consumers who desire those services and can afford to pay for them. And this is where this is so important today, is that this is that part about being able to pay for them. Now, and I'll talk about what falls into this category and why education is kind of in this category and out of this category. Now, as I said, this is about half of all jobs in the United States fall into the consumer service category. So we can basically break consumer services up into one of four groups. Retail and wholesale services. Now that one is fairly straightforward. So this would be places like Kroger. This would be places like Target, Meijer, places like that. Retail stores that sell groceries. It could be Kohl's and places like that sell clothes and other types of goods. Anything that you would see at the mall would be retail or wholesale services. Wholesale is also things like GFS, Sam's Club, things that are selling things in bulk, whether that be, and again, these are for individual purposes only. not businesses. So anything that is selling primarily to individuals but sells it in bulk would fall into that wholesale category. So we have a lot of people working in those sectors. Obviously, that sector is growing significantly right now during this crisis, as those are the businesses that are essential. People need to eat. People need to be able to access medicine, things like that. So those are falling under that category. Education services. So when we talk about education services under consumer services, what we're talking about here is not public K through 12 education. We're talking about private schools at the K through 12 level, and we're talking about colleges and universities. So the key here is that people have to be able to get this thing, and they have to be able to pay for it. So if you're paying for education, then that would fall under a consumer service category. Now, we obviously have a lot of people in this country who work for colleges and universities, so that would count under consumer services, private schools, things like that. We have a small, obviously much smaller percentage of our population who works there, but they also comprise a decent sector of our economy. The third is health and social services. Now, this is anything that is not provided by the public. So if you've been paying attention to Dr. Amy Acton, who's the Ohio Health Director, who's been so prevalent during this crisis, she works for the Ohio Department of Health. That does not count here because that's public health. Those are public services, which we'll get to here in a second. When we talk about health and social services, what we're talking about are hospitals, doctor's offices, anything that charges you for that service. So if you go and get a flu shot and they're $10 and that's going to be provided by any group, that would be, and they charge you for it, that would fall under health and social services. Now, obviously, the medical profession in this country is growing significantly, particularly as seniors age. So health and social services is a significant chunk of our economy, as we have a lot of people working in those medical fields. So health and social services is number 3. And then finally, leisure and hospitality. And this would be things like hotels, this would be restaurants, these would be anything tourist related where people might be going to. Those would fall under consumer services as well. And we obviously have a decent chunk of our population who works there as well. So if you look at this, how this breaks down, about 14% of our country's population is employed in retail industries, another 13.6% in health and social services, and that number has been growing fairly significantly over the last couple decades. 9.5% in higher education and private school education, and another 9% in leisure and hospitality. So that's the consumer services portion of the tertiary sector. Now let's look at the next one, which is the business services. Now, obviously with business services, the primary purpose of these companies is to facilitate other businesses. So obviously Kroger is a business. Okay, it's going to be a business that falls under consumer services. If a business exists to service another business, then they would fall under business services. So we have 3 primary types of businesses here. So these are what we call professional services, financial services, and transportation services. So professional services would be any business that provides something else that another company needs in order to function. So if I am a restaurant, so I'm a consumer service business, but I get all of my food from King Cold Meats there in Inglewood. King Cold Meats would be a professional services business. They exist to service other businesses. Now, periodically, some of these business service type companies will service individuals as well, but primarily they exist to service other businesses. So that would be professional services. We then have financial services, and these are people like accountants or tax preparers, things like that. Again, they can work with individuals, but they primarily work with companies. So if you look at different groups who do accounting services, that would fall under here. I also forgot, under professional services, this would be lawyers as well. So lawyers can obviously represent individuals, but most businesses have lawyers on retainer, things like that, that would fall under professional. But financial would be anything having to do with accounting or tax preparation or things like that. That would be financial services. And then transportation services. Obviously, this is the trucking companies that move goods for Kroger or for Meijer or for Elder Beerman or any of these businesses that rely on logistics and transportation. So obviously, transportation services is an essential business that we're seeing now, part of the supply chain in the United States. Now, the truck driving industry, they're struggling to find workers, and they have been struggling to find workers for a long time now. So this is a segment of our population which is still high, even though we're seeing fewer people in these positions, the demand is still there. So if you look kind of what this looks like, about 11% of our population works in the professional sector. So this could be lawyers, things like that. Transportation and information sector, that would be about 7.4%, and then the financial sector about 6.7%. So there's a decent percentage of our population there as well. And then finally, we have public services. And public services are exactly what it sounds like. Anything that exists to provide services to citizens. So these are people who work in government. Now, this could be local government working for the city of Inglewood. This could be people working for the state. And obviously, as we've seen through this crisis, there's a lot of different arms of state government. So we have the health departments that exist at the county level and at the state level. We have the Department of Aging, which has been significant in all of this. Those are public services as well. And then anything that the federal government does. Now, if you look at employment, about 60% of employment in the public sector is at the local level. And this obviously makes sense because we have a lot of state and local governments. So if you look at particularly local governments, if you look at Montgomery County alone, we have 21 communities in Montgomery County. So each one of them has fire, police, city managers, people like that who are employed in these different positions. And if you multiply that by 50 states and all the different counties in each state, you can see that a lot of people work for local government. State government is about a quarter of public sector employees, and then the federal government is about a sixth of public sector employees. We always hear how big the federal government is, and it is big, but it represents a fairly small sector of public sector employment when you look at the big picture. So again, public sector employment accounts for about 5% of all jobs in the United States. Other service jobs that don't fall into one of these categories make up about 5% of jobs, and the book gives you a pretty good example of what some of those other services are that don't fall into one of these clean categories here. So you need to make sure that you know what those categories are and what types of jobs would fall within those categories. So last slide for today. If you look at kind of the rising and falling of service sector employment, what we see is that the service sector has grown significantly worldwide. So not just in the United States, but if you look at tertiary sector jobs, as more countries develop and they move along these models, is that we see more and more tertiary sector jobs that exist. However, these jobs are the most negatively impacted by recession. So it's going to be really interesting and scary to see what happens here once the coronavirus pandemic passes, what happens with some of these service sector jobs. Restaurants that close, that may never reopen, people who work in barber shops, people who work in places like any sort of small business that really falls into the service sector, who may be struggling during a time like this and may not be able to take the hit of a couple months off. So tertiary sector jobs, much more than any other sector, is hit hardest by recessions. You're still going to need food, so primary sector jobs are always going to exist. People are still going to need to drive cars. They're still going to need to other things that manufacturing will do. So secondary sector jobs will still exist. But tertiary sector jobs really take the biggest hit when people don't have money to spend. So they're the ones that are hit the hardest by a recession. We also have seen changes within certain industries in terms of growth. If you look over the last few years, engineering has really picked up in terms of hiring of engineers, law, any sort of professional management positions. Those are all have seen significant growth, as well as the healthcare field. So if you're looking, obviously with you all being seniors, is that if you look at the jobs in America right now, that we're seeing a lot of growth in those areas. And those are areas that can weather a recession, that will come back. Obviously, we're going to need healthcare workers. We're going to need lawyers, engineers, things like that. So much more than things like retail or wholesale can weather the storm. Those things are much more likely to be able to do that. So if you look at changes in employment, you can see some significant differences there in terms of what things look like in terms of growth of our economy over time. You can see there at the bottom how manufacturing has kind of shrunk a little bit as they show secondary sector jobs there. Hey, so that's it for the notes for today. Your writing prompt for today, I'm going to have you look back at something from the last chapter just to kind of revisit something from chapter 11. I want you to talk about why the Midwest has seen the most, particularly states like Ohio, has seen the most impact from pollution over time, and why some of those pollution numbers have declined over the last couple decades. So why has Ohio seen the most pollution in terms of different types of pollution? We talked about several in the last chapter, and why has that seen a decline over the last several decades? So take a few minutes on the writing prompt form and submit that as your writing prompt for today. Tomorrow we'll get back on here. We'll talk a little bit about central place theory, and we'll also talk tomorrow about changes to the AP test in terms of units and things that will be covered. Hope everybody has a great day. Please stay safe. If you have any questions, please send me an email.